Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to hang out with me today. And thank you to CTA and Virus Bulletin for hosting TIPS, because this is really awesome that we can have this event. So I'm here today to talk to you about the nexus between OT and IT threat intelligence. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Selena Larson. I am a cyber threat intelligence analyst at Dragos. We are an industrial control system cybersecurity company. So my team, threat intelligence team, specializes in OT threat intelligence. In a previous life, I was a cybersecurity and privacy journalist, and it's pretty cool that a lot of the same skills as a journalist map very nicely into becoming an intelligence analyst. So I want to get started with this story, A Tale of Two Hackers. So here on the left, you have CyberDino, or APT3 billion BC, depending on which group or company that you're talking to. This is a financially motivated hacker who executes a ransomware attack. So in terms of their TTPs, what are they going to do? They use spear phishing to gain initial access. They're going to deploy Robinhood ransomware and move through the network via PSExec. This adversary is going to be a cyber criminal. They're interested in making money off of your network, the IT business network. And again, their target is IT-focused business operations. But on the other hand, you have this cyber brontosaur. This is a different adversary. They're going to be interested in disrupting electric distribution. So how are they going to do that? Well, again, spear phishing to gain initial access to the IT network. A little bit similar. But then they are going to get in there and they're either going to use stolen credentials or propagate through the network differently, but they're going to look for a dual-homed IT-OT box, basically something that can allow them to pivot from the IT network to the OT network. Once there, they're going to find their target host and deploy very customized malware, ICS-specific tools and capabilities to achieve the ultimate disruption within the OT. So who is this adversary? Well, they're going to be sufficiently resourced, likely sponsored by an entity who wants to further political means. And the target here, again, initial access in the IT, but their ultimate goal is to use that to facilitate OT access and potentially turn off the lights. So why does this matter? Well, the way that the companies detect and respond to and prevent attacks from each of these different personas is going to vary based on the environment, risk analysis, and business decision. So that means as threat intelligence practitioners, the stuff that we're hunting for and analyzing might start off similar, but then you'll realize that everything from the motivations to the TTPs to the actions on objectives are going to vary between whether you're talking about an IT or an OT-focused adversary. And also the threat intelligence that we actually produce is going to be utilized differently. Again, even if a company, they're receiving the same type of threat intelligence, it's going to be used differently based on whether they're OT or IT. But what are we even talking about when we talk about OT? Operational technology is thought of as mission-critical IT within the ICS. This is the hardware and software that controls and monitors operations in your ICS environment. We're talking about the domain controllers and Windows PCs. And we talk about ICS, again, another acronym here. These are industrial control systems. This is basically an umbrella term for the software and hardware that's going to control and automate the industrial processes. Your ICS environments can vary a lot. We have critical infrastructure, so you have your electric utilities, oil and gas, but then you have pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, stuff like that. And just as a quick caveat, Dragos doesn't actually focus on healthcare at all, so we don't necessarily include that in like those sort of health devices in our assessments. So the cybersecurity principles and the security that threat intelligence is going to help inform and drive is going to vary between IT and OT focused entities. So within the IT, you have the CIA triad, right? You have confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So you want to be able to keep your information private. You don't want it to fall into the wrong hands. You want it to be trustworthy. You want to know that you can trust in the information that's there. And you want your networks and services to be available. You don't want things to go down. That isn't, I don't want to say that it doesn't apply in OT, the CIA triad necessarily, but it's not really comprehensive enough to really describe what we're talking about in terms of OT targeting adversaries and what they can actually do. So my boss, the VP of Threat Intelligence, Sergio Caltagirone, came up with the VICES model. And this is view, input, output, control, engineering, and safety. So when we're talking about view, this refers to the ability to actually monitor or read the system state. Input-output is everything from the communications as well as the actual physical relationships between systems, right? So that could mean in the OT is a little bit different than the IT. If you are a manufacturer and your shipping and logistics is disrupted down the line, you might actually stop manufacturing. So that's kind of an input-output issue that you don't really see in IT. And then you have control. So this is the ability to actually modify a system state. That could be a device continues to operate, but the controller engineer can't do anything about it. Maybe it's not operational at all. And then when we're talking about engineering, so this is the actual physical controls and specifications of your non-digital assets. So basically, how fast can a centrifuge spin before it breaks? And then we talk about safety. And so when you're talking to OT and ICS folks, this is usually going to be the most important piece. We care about safe and reliable power. We care about environmental safety, human safety, food and drug safety. All of these things really play a role there. And potentially disrupting the safety of an OT system could potentially cause really catastrophic results. I wanted to talk about a couple common myths and misconceptions when it comes to OT and threat intelligence. This is the idea that ICS networks are air-gapped. No. Typical OT systems will have a demilitarized zone that you have to kind of jump through to get there. Oftentimes you'll have folks going through from the corporate to the plant. They're bringing their laptops and they're walking through there. You have vendors that have to go in there either for maintenance or engineering purposes. Sometimes that's whether you're like VPNing in or they're just physically in there to install firmware or other updates. This other idea is that OT staff don't care about security. They don't patch and they won't scan. That's not true either. They do actually care about it a lot, but they also care about the consequences. So what's going to happen if I issue this patch to my plant? Is it going to take this machine down that'll cost millions of dollars a day for my company? Also, is this vulnerability scan going to potentially break something? You will have patch cycles that are planned out sometimes months or years in advance. And if something drops right before a patch cycle, it's probably not going to be incorporated in there because they need time to sort of test it and validate it and make sure it won't screw anything up. And then you have this idea that OT systems are easy to hack because we see them on Shodan. Seeing something on Shodan, for instance, in HMI, doesn't necessarily indicate a vulnerability to an actual consequence. OT, ICS, SCADA devices, they have a lot of digital and safety controls built in them, especially when we're talking about critical infrastructure like electric utilities or oil and gas. So modifying something or playing with something that's on the open internet might do something and might not do anything at all. And a lot of times what you're seeing on Shodan are potentially ICS honeypots, things like that. So I just kind of want to get that out of the way here. But that's not to say that you can't use it for threat intelligence, right? It's really useful in terms of OSINT, potentially. But just because it's there, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to turn off the lights. There are a lot of similarities between the two, IT and OT threat intelligence. So the goals of threat intelligence on both sides are the same, right? Like we want to obtain actionable information on these adversaries so that defenders and organizations can reduce harm through better security decision making. Some additional similarities. You'll see similar tactics, techniques, and procedures. You have spear phishing, watering hole attacks. These are common TTPs that you're going to see from OT-focused adversaries with the initial access vector. Again, IT networks can be initial access vectors like we kind of saw with the cyber brontosaur. They're going to use that to facilitate their OT network access. There's this idea of threats to IT networking infrastructure that can impact ICS. A good example of that actually is this quote-unquote cyber event that happened at an electric utility back in March in the United States. Some of you might have heard about it recently because new information actually came out about that. And the cyber event itself was actually a vulnerability in the web interface of this utility that an attacker was actually able to modify and cause a denial of service. A brief disruption of communication between field devices and the sites, and from the sites and the control center. So again, that was something that was IT related that did actually impact the OT there. And then you have things like engineering workstations, human-machine interfaces, data historians, OPC servers. These are going to run Windows operating systems. You're going to see familiar OS there. It's not going to be Windows 10, probably, but you will see that familiar OS. And then IT ransomware can infect and disrupt the OT. This is something that we have seen certainly recently as well, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. There are also a lot of differences when it comes to IT and OT threat intelligence. The adversaries are different, even among the potential similar groups. You have those that specialize in IT and specialize in OT. The consequences of cyber attacks are different. Successful attacks can cause catastrophic human and environmental harm. And this is a personal reason why I really like my job, is because I feel like the threat intelligence that we produce could potentially be used to block or prevent a very catastrophic event from happening. Someone might not get hurt. The environment might not be completely destroyed. So that's kind of a cool outcome of the work that we do. ICS threat intelligence is going to fall into 3 categories. You have your interested adversary direct ICS threat and indirect ICS threat. We're talking about interested adversaries. This would be intelligence on activities of adversaries that are known to have a very specific interest in control systems, operations networks, or ICS organizations. It might vary based on who you're talking to, but at Dragos we include adversaries that don't necessarily possess an ICS-specific capability. That means they don't necessarily have ICS-specific malware, but they have shown a sustained and specific interest in ICS organizations. An example of this would be an activity group that we call Magnalium. They target oil and gas in a variety of different geographies, but recent activity would actually include an uptick in password spraying targeting oil and gas following some of the recent tensions in the Middle East. And then you're going to have your direct ICS impact. And so this would be intelligence on threats that are directly affecting the operation of industrial control systems. Here you have something like Trisis. Trisis was a highly tailored, very specific malware that targeted a safety instrumented system at an oil and gas facility in the Middle East. It was designed to directly affect that specific ICS. It was a Schneider Electric safety instrumented system. And they were able to sort of customize the malware to facilitate a potential event. And then you have the indirect ICS impact. So this would be intelligence on threats that are not associated with industrial control systems, but have a high likelihood of disrupting their operation. Here we're talking about ransomware would be a great example. WannaCry and NotPetya, 2 very disastrous ransomware malware incidents, and they did actually impact operations at a variety of different facilities. For instance, NotPetya took down the pharmaceutical company Merck for quite a while. Their packaging, manufacturing, and formulation operations were disrupted for weeks. Actually, recently in the news, we've seen evidence or reporting of some pretty disruptive incidents. They're called malware events or cyber incident. Companies don't ever really want to come out and say, oh, we got ransomware and it totally stopped our production. So you've seen some recent examples like that. The one I have off the top of my head is a recent automotive manufacturing company. Their IT systems got hit and it disrupted their operations. So it's pretty interesting to kind of see that happening with increasingly worrying regularity, it seems. In terms of the differences, so the threat landscape is a lot different. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. OT does have enterprise technology, but a lot of it does require specialized knowledge. So just because an adversary is able to access the company's operations doesn't mean they're going to actually be able to do anything that's highly targeted. An adversary must maintain access and learn 2 different networks with specialized technology requiring specialized capabilities. Again, they're probably going to get in there through the IT, pivot into the OT, and then what do they do? So that means that they're going to take a while to learn how things work. Every single OT facility and network is going to be different. You're never going to have it be copied and pasted, even if it's within the same industry, for instance, oil and gas. It's all going to be different. In different geographies, it's going to be different. The protocols are different. So you have to spend time actually learning that, understanding that, reverse engineering some of the devices that you're going to find before you can actually do anything. That means as defenders and threat intelligence practitioners, we can provide information to these guys and say, hey, look for these types of TTPs, look for these threat behaviors, and then you have more time to be able to identify this potential threat and kick them out before they can do anything disruptive. Components of threat intelligence might be the same. For instance, you have your indicators of compromise and threat behaviors, a lot of stuff that we've been talking about all day. But the behaviors themselves are going to be a lot different. So within IT, you have your pretty typical using built-in Windows tools to kind of move around the network or deploy things, whatever. But within OT, it's a lot different. So for instance, you might VPN into an HMI where you set up a new user account, download a file, and then try to connect and operate a PLC. That is seemingly normal behavior, but perhaps it shouldn't be happening. So that could be an identification of SCADA hijack behavior. So finally, the decision-making calculus is different, and this is really across the board, right? So you're going to be making different business decisions based on this. Again, if you think about patching or updating, is this going to cost my company millions of dollars if I do this? Should I wait until it doesn't? In terms of policy decisions as well, that's something that are often made based off of these sort of big attacks, this sort of national security or policy things that are going on. That plays a role as well. Whoever is receiving that information, that threat intelligence, you have to be able to sort of tailor that and understand how the decisions are going to be made off of that. And again, this might be totally different if it's the same company on the IT side versus the OT side. So talking about the threat landscape, so as our capabilities in threat hunting and identification of ICS-focused threats expand, we achieve greater visibility into the threat landscape and can create a more holistic picture of the threats, behaviors, and tradecraft affecting ICS environments. Historically, there's been pretty limited visibility into OT networks. There hasn't been a whole lot of data collection and telemetry available for hunting or identification purposes, but we have actually gained a lot more visibility. So we're able to find more and see more. I do want to kind of put a caveat, though. Because we're gaining more visibility, we are identifying large numbers of adversaries, of course, but that doesn't mean that they weren't there before. It just means that maybe we didn't find them. So we anticipate that as our visibility increases, that's definitely going to change as well. So Dragos tracks 9 activity groups targeting ICS, OT. I don't want to give you like a total threat briefing right now, but we do consider 2 to be fairly dangerous and capable. That would be Xenotime. That was the activity group that was behind the Trisis malware. So they've showed a lot of interest in being able to create very specific ICS-tailored malware to cause potential disruption. And then you have Electrum. This is the activity group that was responsible for the crash override malware. That was an event back in 2016 that targeted an electric transmission station in Ukraine. They actually were able to build malware that specifically targeted switchgear and circuit breaker to toggle them on and off. And in the malware, they had many different modules that were very specific to protocols within that environment. And again, ICS-specific malware, because we haven't seen too much evidence of this. You have crash override and Trisis. Trisis happened in 2017. So 2018 was a fairly quiet year in terms of public announcements of this type of malware, but we anticipate that that is going to increase as folks increase their capabilities and investment. And then you have supply chain and third-party access. This is a trend that we're seeing among OT targeting adversaries. One that's pretty unique is original equipment manufacturers. We have actually seen Xenotime targeting OEMs. We haven't shared a lot of information on this, but it is pretty concerning because original equipment manufacturers are not necessarily specific to one industry within the OT. Even though OT environments are totally different, a lot of them use very similar devices or mechanisms. And if an activity group or an actor is able to compromise an OEM, that could potentially be dangerous for across the industry. And then you have telecommunications. This is kind of an interesting one, actually. We recently released a report on Hexane. This is an activity group that targets oil and gas, but they also targeted telecommunications entities. Why would that be useful or interesting? Well, if you think about very spread out facilities, you have offshore oil and gas drilling, for instance. You have potentially wind farms that are found pretty far away, right? And so you have these that are monitored and controlled by mobile or satellite networks. So being able to compromise the telecommunications infrastructure of potentially an OT network, then you might be able to sort of control these offshore or really spread out, thank you, networks. And so then you have remote access and vendor access. We have seen OT entities targeting remote access portals and VPN gateways. Vendor access is another really good one. Oftentimes they might push over-the-air updates. They send firmware packages. They have, whether that's remotely or they actually set foot in your environment to actually update things and get things moving. There is one actually interesting case that I think is pretty interesting. Nothing actually happened from it, but last year there was an electric utility device manufacturer that shipped a device with a USB that may have been infected with malware at a third-party company. So they put out this alert, and they're like, hey, FYI, please don't use this USB. And although nothing actually happened from that, there wasn't any public reported actual malware infections. That's a very interesting attack vector and threat surface that you might not think of. If an adversary is able to sort of hijack the USB manufacturer of a particular device's information or booklet or whatever the company is shipping it with, that could potentially cause a lot of problems. And then you have these systematic and input-output threats. We talked a little bit about that before, but again, you have a lot of variables that are along a very broad supply chain when it comes to OT. I'll give you a couple examples of what adversaries might do. So if you're targeting a coal power generation plant, you might target the railway system. Why? Because the railway system is going to be transporting the coal to the coal power generation. If they don't get that coal, they're not going to make power. So by targeting the railway station, you might not even have to access the OT networks of the coal power generation, but you're still able to disrupt operations there. Another example would be if you want to potentially impact electric distribution or transmission in the west coast of the United States, let's say California. You might want to target the Vancouver natural gas pipeline, knock that down, have that go out for about a day or two, and then the residual effects of that are going to be outages in California or potentially other places along the west coast. So these are sort of the systematic input-output threats that you don't really have in IT. There's also this idea of the proliferation of threats. This is something that we obviously saw that was very similar to nuclear weapons proliferation, that concern there. But threats are also spreading in the cyber realm as well. Why is this? Well, governments are increasingly investing in offensive cyber capabilities and the ability to disrupt critical infrastructure. That's not necessarily a secret either. If you follow the news when it comes to OT stuff pretty closely, you might have recently seen some countries talking about possessing these capabilities and potentially doing stuff with them. So we're seeing that they want to create these capabilities across the board. It's not just the people that we think are the bad guys. It's also becoming easier to obtain the resources and skills necessary for a disruptive cyber-physical event. Even you have these legitimate penetration testing platforms that are incorporating ICS, SCADA, OT-specific modules within them. That's great, of course, for your red teamers, but then you also might have adversaries that are using these publicly available tools to potentially work that into their operations as well. Again, it's not necessarily super easy to be able to learn this. A lot of it is very, very specialized. It takes a long time to be able to understand and know this, but it is becoming increasingly more available to more people. And then I just wanted to kind of point out an example of this proliferation of threats. Xenotime, again. My favorite. They targeted oil and gas initially with Trisis, but we actually observed them expanding, not shifting, but expanding their interests to include electric utilities as well. So adversaries are not staying within one industry. The scope can expand across various industries. So when it comes to generating OT threat intelligence, so like we've said, the OT threats are a lot different from the enterprise. Equipment is unique. Your high-value assets, what you care about, is a lot different. And the cyber risk that your company is willing to accept will vary between organizations. So hunting for these threats and producing threat intelligence needs to take all of those differences into consideration. When you're talking about your high-value assets, they're often called the crown jewels. These, again, they will vary by industry and even within companies, right? Like an oil and gas facility in one part of the country might have totally different crown jewels. And so do the motivations for attacking them. So for instance, you have your data historians. That contains a lot of production and process data, a lot of really good insight into the business. So an adversary might attack that for economic purposes to further their own business interests. If we're talking about chemical processing, you might have an adversary that's interested in making their own pharmaceuticals. So they might go after the physical controls that are actually manufacturing the product to steal that IP. And then finally, you have safety controls. We have obviously seen adversaries target this particular control mechanism, but doing so, the consequences are really harming people or harming the environment. It could cause really big catastrophic disruptions. So if an adversary wants to do that, that's what they might target. So when you're developing a hunting hypothesis within an OT environment, excuse me, you really want to understand the adversary's behavior. So let's use the example of Xenotime targeting OEMs in the supply chain. So your hypothesis might be, if I increase the number of third-party service providers with access to my OT, then this will provide adversaries with additional avenues of access to my sensitive processes. So this really helps you get an idea of where to start hunting and generating threat intel. You want to identify your third-party service provider and vendor relationship connections as a starting point for detecting that potentially malicious activity. You also want to be able to develop sufficient data sources and visibility. I mentioned earlier that there's kind of been a lack of visibility when it comes to cyber threats within the OT. That's of course getting better, but you want to be able to do things like potentially deploy threat detection and response capabilities within the OT. Potentially set up honeypots to be able to identify adversary activity that's interested in a particular device or mechanism. And to be able to do that, you can gain additional telemetry and more information that can give you a starting point for hunting. You want to understand the audience and be aware of the context to make the threat intelligence relevant. So who's actually receiving your threat intelligence? Is it executives? Is it folks that are focused on business interests? Are they focused on their strategic interests? Who's receiving this threat intelligence? Because what you produce and the information that you share is going to vary based on who's getting it. You also want to understand the customer environments and the operational requirements to make useful recommendations. Vulnerability scanning can totally break the OT. If your threat intelligence product says, here's a defensive recommendation, scan for this vulnerability, that might take down the entire plant. Endpoint detection does not exist or isn't supported. Again, specialized threat detection and response capabilities will be very useful here, but your sort of typical endpoint stuff may not work. And then OT threat intelligence should help IT understand the threat impact and context. You really want these groups to be able to work together and collaborate and understand the threats that way. And then you really also want to understand outside factors too. So this idea of attacks on ICS entities like oil and gas or electric utilities, that they can be used to further political, economic, and national security goals. This is additionally kind of a little bit of a differentiator when it comes to OT and IT threat intelligence too, right? You're not really seeing a whole lot of crimeware targeted specifically at OT. The adversaries are generally backed or motivated by a little bit more of serious motivations there. And so when it comes to operationalizing threat intelligence, I want to kind of take away these few things from my talk. We definitely covered a lot of ground here. But if we can remember that the goals for threat intelligence are largely similar for IT and OT threat intelligence practitioners. We want to collect the information and distribute it and be able to provide customers with the best ways to protect themselves and prevent threats. The attacker capabilities, motivation, and attack surface vary between IT and OT targeting adversaries. Although you might have an OT targeting adversary that gets in through the IT, they're going to require a lot of understanding, development, tool development, and a deep understanding of both the environment as well as whatever host or device that they're targeting. Security decisions within the IT and OT are going to be made differently, even if it's based on the same intelligence, whether that's whether or not you want to patch, wait until the next patching cycle to actually distribute this patch, even if that's months down the line, versus in IT, you might do that overnight. I also want to point out here too that within the OT environments, there are a lot of different requirements and regulations that govern them. For instance, in the United States, electric utilities have very tight regulations. Cybersecurity is very important there. So they're going to be making a totally different decision when it comes to security, patching, et cetera, than you might see with, for instance, a manufacturing company. And then it takes everyone working together to make ICS entities and the communities that they operate in and support safer and more secure. That includes everybody in this room, right? It's really important. These systems are very critical to our way of life, whether that's electric, oil and gas, making our cars go, keeping the lights on. And it's really cool to be able to collaborate across the board, regardless of what you specialize in, to be able to make these communities and these networks a lot safer. That's all I have for today. I think I Yeah, just literally just hit time. Perfect. But if anyone has any questions, I will be hanging out around the rest of the conference, so I'm happy to talk about anything. Thank you.